So I'm going to veer now from your interest in history and kind of how your channel started into a historic topic. And I like to start off with what I call the word association game. So word association game, you may not know quite where it's headed right away. Usually by the end, you can pretty much tell what kind of historic event or something that I'm referring to. So I'm going to give you a word. You say the first thing that comes to mind. And if you're listening or if you're watching, feel free to play along. This is just kind of a fun way to broach a topic. So if I was to say 1950s, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Eisenhower.
Okay. How about Hollywood? What would you think?
Jimmy Stewart.
Oh, that's a good one. Jen likes that. Okay. If I was to say Lucille Ball, what would you think?
Redhead.
Okay. Now, how about McCarthy?
Witch Hunt.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting closer here. How about House Un-American Activities?
Is that the answer or the question?
Yeah, that's the last word.
Again, witch hunt probably again.
Yeah, that's the last word. What's that make you think of?
Persecution.
Yeah, absolutely. And so really what I'm driving at is the Red Scare, right? So the Red Scare of the kind of starting in the 20s all the way up through the 50s, where it was at its peak. And so I talked about the 1950s, Hollywood, and I threw Hollywood in there, right, because your channel, right? So I kind of did that a little bit on purpose, like some movie stuff. Lucille Ball, she actually was blacklisted for a little while.
She was accused of communism.
And then obviously McCarthy, he was the one kind of leading the whole charge with the House Un-American Activities and that whole Red Scare back then. So we do that. One, it's a kind of a fun way to broach a topic, but I also like to ask people, what do you remember learning about, maybe either when you were younger or something that stands out to you now that you learned about that event later on that you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, I never knew that.
Yeah, I suspect this is true for many Americans, but I don't really recall learning much of anything about it in high school. Maybe a little bit in college, and it hasn't been until more recent years that I've started to look into it a little bit more. And interestingly enough, I'm currently reading a book called Hollywood Victory, which looks at Hollywood during the World War II years in the 1940s. And that book has a number of sections that are very much dedicated to the Red Scare, both before, during, and after the Second World War. And, there were a number of individuals, James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, who were really persecuted by the forces within the Red Scare because this may seem really like an oxymoron to us today, but they were anti-fascist a little bit too early, and for that reason they were targeted. They were banging the drum against Nazism in the mid-1930s when that was very unpopular in the United States. And that is one of the things that propelled James Cagney to take on what would ultimately become his award-winning performance in Yankee Doodle Dandy.
She loves, Jen absolutely loves that movie.
So the stars are aligning here this evening.
Yeah.
But one reason he took that on was to show how patriotic he was. And combined with that, he was on the war bond tours in a very, very vigorous way. And so it's interesting to see how the Red Scare shaped the careers of a lot of really well-known Hollywood figures from this classic era. And some of them were able to dodge the bullet ultimately, like James Cagney and Lucille Ball. But Edward G. Robinson, of course, later on, Dalton Trumbo, who Bryan Cranston
Charlie Chaplin
portrays. Yeah, and Charlie Chaplin especially is a tragic figure because he made movies championing the plight of the poor, speaking out for pacifism, making movies that were a mockery of Hitler. All of these are good things, I think we would argue. And for doing that, he's booted out of the United States for well over 30 years. And so it was a process of that created many victims, unfortunately, who did not deserve it.
Yeah, I would have to echo what you said. I don't really remember too much learning about it too much in high school. Maybe in like AP US history, right? Maybe just like hearing about blacklisting, right? That's probably the one thing that kind of always stuck out to me. And then again, later on in college, a little bit more. And then I've learned more history being married to this one than I ever did in school. So,
and I think I learned through the movies, Jared, right? Because I remember watching Chaplin, right? And watching Chaplin with Robert Downey Jr.
Oh, yeah.
Is when I first was like, why did he get kicked out of America? Like, why did he live in Switzerland all that time? And that's when I first really learned about the Red Scare. And it was probably not for college. I got my undergrads in accounting at Penn State, but I have the minor in history. But I really didn't. It wasn't. It was military history, So it was probably in between there, just movie related, And I knew James Cagney was and the Yankee Doodle Dandy. No one questioned his patriotism after that. Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, everyone who's kind of doing all the war movies and stuff, right? So, and I saw you just did the Jimmy Stewart Museum. We had done that about a year ago. Yeah. And I remember that poster with all the actors on it who were in the military.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And I named them.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Because there were many male actors who joined the military during that time.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
It's really neat.
The 50s, every time, the more videos we do, right, the more topics, like conversations we get to have with fellow history fans like you, the more I learn, like, one of our biggest series, right, is Emmett Till. We did a 3-part series on Emmett Till and kind of all that stuff. And it's some of our more popular videos. And one of the things we did for the videos that I actually didn't think about at first, but we went back and did and added it in, was kind of set the stage for what was happening in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And the 50s was such, I mean, World War II had just kind of ended not too long ago. And the 50s, baby boom, but there's so much happening in the 50s, whether it comes to the Red Scare or, I mean, simple like desegregation, like simple household American things, like Disneyland opened, different things like, I mean, all this stuff, this growth and this conflict. And the 50s was, every time we talk about it, the more and more I'm like, man, the 50s keeps popping up like every single time we talk about some historic event or era, and it's got a tie to that period, And, when I was kind of coming up with this word association game, I didn't realize how, like you said earlier, how much some people were persecuted for just literally protesting, and not protesting against America, just protesting in general. Like J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, they would be like, oh yeah, you're a protester? Okay, you're blacklisted and you're probably a communist and you're in trouble.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there was so much scandal in Hollywood. Let's not, beat around the bush. There was a lot of that going on. And unless you are putting out there your 100% patriotism, you're being investigated.
Right. Unless you're like James Cagney and James Yankee.
Well, you make
Dandy.
a movie like that. Like you make a movie. Like you're making this huge message. But if you're on the fence, or if you're a foreigner, if you're someone who wasn't born in America, if you've made a movie that was on the edge of social norms, right? Like you're going to be investigated because it could, you're influencing people and you're influencing people's character, and it's anti-American. And so those kind of things, what actors did back then, some of them took a stand, and, Lucille Ball took a stand. Yeah, it was an interesting time.
Have you done any kind of 50s era movie reviews? I haven't watched every single video on your channel. Some of your videos are pretty long because you're talking about movie sections. But have you done some that kind of either stand out to you or they're like some of your favorites?
One of our first videos that we did was the movie 42, which is the Jackie Robinson story, and it begins in the late 40s and goes into the early 50s. But there are a lot of 50s themed movies that I would love to take a look at a little bit more in depth. And then there's even quasi-fantasy films that depict the 50s. One of my favorites is Pleasantville. Where young Tobey Maguire is pulled into this Mayberry-like setting, Leave It to Beaver setting, and starts turning the world upside down within his television set. And so, you know, I'd be interested in looking at films like that as well. But we've accumulated a very long list of movies from our various comments and emails that we get, and we've only scratched the surface thus far.
Yeah,
I know.
We just reviewed on the Talk with History podcast. We just reviewed Elvis. Jen went and saw the movie Elvis. She loved it.
So I got my master's at the University of Memphis. Yeah. So it kind of helps that I was immersed in Elvis history for 3 years. Yeah. And I also emphasized race in my master's degree. So that also helped, like being on Beale Street, doing a lot of that kind of research. It just immersed me in all of that. So I could talk to, that didn't happen at that concert, it happened at this concert, and that's not what that has happened. You know, like, so I kind of knew all of that information. Just, I'm not an Elvis historian, and I put that out there, but you cannot live in Memphis, Tennessee, and not know these things. Elvis is the town, right? And living there, so all these people had personal Elvis stories. It was just amazing to me how much he was Memphis, Tennessee.
And even for me, right, as someone, you know, I generally know who Elvis is and have learned more, but just talking to her, I haven't seen the movie yet. She went and saw it like early opening night or something like that. And but even just kind of her taking me through the movie, saying, hey, they did this and he sung this song, but he didn't actually write that song until 2 years later, or, you know, but obviously for the movie, they always compress events and things like that. So that was, it was interesting hearing that.
But I saw you did It's a Wonderful Life. Have you done Yankee Doodle Dandy yet?
Not yet, but I will add it on to the list right now.
Oh my God. I would love to do it with you but I love that George Cohan watched that movie and said, that's great. Who is that about?
Yeah.
So another way to, whitewash movies for the American people, make sure they have good character in them, because George M. Cohan wasn't the most clean-cut guy.
Right. So Jared, one of the next things we like to ask our guests, because I playfully mention this to people, to friends, and I would say, hey, come listen to our podcast. I playfully mention, like, hey, this isn't necessarily a history podcast. This is a person podcast. So I actually like to ask our guests, what's the first big historical event that you remember as a youth?